One eternity later. 3 days later. 12 seconds later. 10 seconds later. 346 minutes later. Much later. 3 days later. 2 very boring minutes later. Lot of boring math later. 24 hours later. 1 week later. 1 long angry line later. 72 hours later. The following Thursday, 5 minutes later, 24 hours later, much later, much later. The next day, later, 20 minutes later, 3 weeks later, many months later, 2,000 years later. A few inches later, 6 hours later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later. Flashback. End of flashback. 1 semester later. 15 minutes later. Several months later. 75 years later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 1 minute 37 seconds later. 1 hour later.